Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. The Discovery. Detective Michael Hensley had been called to a derelict house on the outskirts of Blackwood, a town infamous for its silences and the way its secrets lingered in the shadows. The house had been abandoned for years, leaning against the sky with its rotting timbers like a drunken man clutching at nothing. Hensley's footsteps crunched on the gravel path leading to the porch, his breath visible in the early morning chill. The call had been routine, a report of trespassers, but something about the officer's tone on the radio had nagged at him. "Found something in the basement," Officer Carter had said. "You'll want to see it for yourself." The porch groaned under Hensley's weight as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was damp and carried a faint, cloying smell. He followed the flashlight beams down a staircase that seemed far too narrow for comfort. In the basement, Carter stood near a long, dust-covered workbench. On it sat a small, cracked mirror, but it wasn't the mirror that held Carter's attention. It was what hung on the far wall, a map of the town, riddled with red pins. Each pin had a date scrawled in barely legible handwriting beneath it. The dates spanned decades, but what froze Hensley's blood was the consistency of the intervals between them, every 3 years, to the day. "This isn't just a map," Carter said, his voice strained. "It's a timeline." Part 2, Patterns in the Red. Hensley leaned in closer to examine the map. The pins marked locations scattered across Blackwood, a gas station, a park, the old high school. Each pin was accompanied by those meticulous dates, scrawled in a hand trembling with either age or anticipation. "What's the connection?" Hensley asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Carter or himself. Carter shook his head. "We've been cross-referencing the dates since we called you. Every 3 years something happens. Disappearances mostly. People, pets, sometimes both. Victims?" Hensley's stomach churned. The smell in the basement was stronger now, like mildew mixed with something more putrid. "Maybe. But it doesn't make sense." Carter pointed to one of the earliest pins. "Take this one. January 15th, 1974. That year, an entire family vanished, parents, 2 kids. House was found locked from the inside. No signs of a break-in. Then look here, January 15th, 1993. That was the Mitchell boy. Found his bike by the creek, but no body. And no one connected the dots?" Hensley's voice was low, anger simmering beneath his words. "It's Blackwood," Carter said flatly. "People here don't ask questions they don't want answered." Hensley turned back to the map, his eyes darting to the next pin in the sequence. January 15th, 2023. "That's tomorrow." Carter hesitated. "There's one more thing, sir." He gestured to the far side of the workbench. A battered cardboard box sat there, its lid askew. Hensley reached inside and pulled out an envelope sealed with wax. The wax bore no insignia, just a perfect, unnerving circle. He broke it open and unfolded the brittle paper inside. The message was brief, scrawled in the same trembling hand as the dates. "The 5th is chosen. You are too late." Hensley's hand tightened around the paper. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he turned to Carter. "Get the lab down here. I want fingerprints, DNA, everything." Carter's radio crackled to life before he could respond. "Officer down, Maplewood and 5th. Requesting immediate backup." Hensley's chest tightened. He glanced at the map. One of the red pins hovered near Maplewood Street. The blood-stained timeline wasn't done yet. Part 3, the 5th marker. Hensley was already halfway to his car by the time Carter caught up. The cold morning air hit him like a slap, sharp and sobering, as he started the engine and floored the gas pedal. Maplewood and 5th was less than 10 minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. The radio buzzed with frantic updates. Suspect fled the scene, unknown direction. Victim unresponsive, severe trauma to the neck. Carter swore under his breath as he fumbled with his seatbelt. "You think this is related to the map?" "It has to be," Hensley said through gritted teeth. "The date's too close. Someone's playing this out, and we're catching up to a game that's been in play for years." When they arrived, the scene was a mess of flashing blue lights and shouting officers. The body lay in the middle of the street, crumpled like a discarded doll. Hensley's stomach sank as he approached. The victim, a man in his mid-30s, was face down, his shirt soaked with blood. Around him, a growing pool of crimson spread like ink on paper. "ID?" Hensley asked one of the officers on site. "Name's Eric Mathers," the officer replied, his face pale. "Local bartender. No family, kept to himself." Hensley crouched beside the body. The wound on Mather's neck was jagged, as if torn by something sharp but imprecise. Not a clean cut, more like an attack born of fury. He noticed something else, too. Clutched in the victim's hand was a crumpled scrap of paper. Carefully, he pried it free, smoothing it out under the beam of his flashlight. The writing was the same as the note in the basement. 4 chilling words scrawled in ink that had bled into the fibers of the page. "The 5th is Eric." Hensley's jaw tightened. A shadow of movement caught his eye, and he glanced up toward a darkened alley just beyond the scene. "Carter, over here!" he called, already moving toward it. The alley was a narrow cut between 2 abandoned buildings. It stank of garbage and damp stone. Halfway down, Hensley saw it, a fresh smear of blood on the wall, leading toward a rusted metal door left slightly ajar. "You think he went in there?" Carter asked, drawing his weapon. Hensley nodded, gripping his own pistol. "Stay close." They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed them immediately, their flashlights slicing through the gloom. The room smelled of rust and rot, and the floor was littered with debris, shattered glass, splintered wood, and something worse. In the center of the room, a chair sat beneath a bare bulb that dangled from the ceiling. On the chair was another envelope, identical to the one found in the basement. This one bore a single word on the front. "Detective." Hensley's pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for it. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the note inside. His flashlight trembled as he read. "They all lead to you." The bulb above flickered violently, and then, with a pop, the room plunged into darkness. Part 4, Into the Abyss. For a moment, Hensley stood frozen in the pitch black, his breath shallow and quick. The only sound was the faint creak of the door behind him as it slowly swayed on its hinges. Carter's flashlight beam sliced through the dark, finding Hensley's face. "You good?" Carter asked, his voice low. Hensley nodded, though his pulse thundered in his ears. He reached into his pocket for his backup flashlight, the beam joining Carter's as they swept the room. "Whoever left that note is playing with us. They wanted us here. They still might be," Carter muttered, glancing toward the darkened corners. Hensley's eyes were drawn back to the chair. Something felt off. He leaned closer, his flashlight's beam focused on the seat. A smear of blood ran down the side, pooling faintly on the floor below. He knelt, pulling a pen from his pocket to prod the edge of the chair's cushion. It lifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was another envelope, smaller than the first, sealed with the same unmarked wax. But this one wasn't addressed to him. It read, "For the chosen." Hensley frowned. "Chosen for what?" Before Carter could answer, a muffled sound echoed through the building, a sharp, rhythmic tap, like footsteps on concrete. Both men raised their weapons, flashlights darting toward the source. "Who's there?" Hensley called, his voice firm. "Blackwood PD, step into the light, hands where I can see them." The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the sense of being watched. Then, from somewhere above, a slow, deliberate creak broke the quiet, a floorboard straining under weight. Hensley glanced at Carter, who mouthed, "Upstairs." The two moved toward a metal staircase at the back of the room, their boots crunching on the debris-littered floor. Every step up the stairs groaned beneath them, the sound amplified in the empty building. At the top, they found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with doors, most of them warped and splintered with age. "Which one?" Carter whispered. Hensley gestured toward the door at the far end. It was ajar, revealing a faint sliver of light beyond. They moved cautiously, their weapons raised. The hallway felt endless, each step echoing back at them as though mocking their approach. As they reached the door, Hensley paused, his hand hovering near the handle. He nodded at Carter, who tightened his grip on his weapon. Together, they pushed it open. The room was small, bare except for a single table in the center. On the table was a set of photographs, neatly arranged in a grid. Hensley's breath hitched as he stepped closer. Each photo was of a person. Eric Mathers. The Mitchell boy from 1993. The vanished family from 1974. Victims spanning decades. And at the center of the grid was the most recent photo, a candid shot of Hensley himself, standing in his office at the station. "What the hell?" Carter whispered. Underneath the grid of photos was another note, pinned with a thin, rusted nail. Hensley ripped it free, his eyes scanning the words. "Tomorrow. Midnight. The clock strikes for you." From behind them, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed again, this time running. By the time they spun around, the hallway was empty. "Move!" Hensley barked, racing toward the stairs. But by the time they reached the bottom, the metal door was swinging on its hinges, letting in the cold night air. Whoever had been with them was gone. Part 5, The Marked Ones. Hensley stepped outside, the chill of the night biting through his jacket. His flashlight darted across the alley, catching only wet brick walls and puddles reflecting the distant streetlights. Carter followed close behind, muttering curses under his breath. "They were here the whole time," Carter said. "Watching us. Waiting. They didn't just wait," Hensley replied grimly, holding up the photo from the table. "They planned." "That's me, Carter. I'm on their list." Carter stopped short. "What do you mean? This doesn't make sense. The victims, they don't have anything in common. Different ages, jobs, lives. They have one thing in common now." Hensley turned the photo over. On the back, in the same erratic handwriting as the notes, was scrawled a single word. "Connected." The weight of the word hung in the air between them. Carter ran a hand through his hair, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grasp. "We need to get back to the station, pull files on all these people. If this is some kind of pattern, we have to break it before midnight tomorrow." Hensley nodded, though the pit in his stomach churned. As they climbed into the car and sped back toward the station, his thoughts spiraled. The map, the notes, the photos, they weren't clues anymore. They were a countdown. At the station, Hensley and Carter locked themselves in the archives room. The scent of old paper and stale coffee hung in the air as file after file was strewn across the table. They worked in silence, piecing together the fractured lives of the victims. Eric Mathers, a bartender with no family and no known enemies. The Mitchell boy, a shy child who loved to collect rocks along the creek. The Henderson family, churchgoers, quiet, kept to themselves. And yet, something was there, just beneath the surface. A shadow that bound them together. "Wait," Carter said suddenly, pointing to a note in the Henderson file. "This can't be a coincidence." Hensley leaned in. It was an old police report, detailing the family's disappearance. Buried in the details was a single witness statement, taken from a neighbor. "They'd been talking about some kind of visitor. Someone who came by late at night, asking questions. Sounded strange, like he knew them. Someone approached them," Hensley muttered. "Not random. Chosen." Carter pulled another file, the Mitchell boy's disappearance. "Same thing here. His parents told police they'd seen someone outside the house the night before. A man in dark clothes. They thought he was a drifter." Hensley clenched his jaw. He flipped open Eric Mathers' file. There wasn't much, just a few routine reports of bar fights and petty theft. But one note stood out. A witness had reported a man sitting alone at Mathers' bar for hours the night before his death. Unnerving was the word used to describe him. "They were stalked," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone picked them out, planned it. And now they've picked me," Hensley replied, his voice hollow. As the clock crept toward midnight, Hensley sat alone in his office, staring at the map from the basement. His photo was at the center now, pinned with one of the red markers. The phone rang, shattering the silence. He answered, his voice tight. Hensley. A distorted voice on the other end whispered. We see you. Midnight comes soon. The line went dead. Hensley's knuckles whitened around the receiver. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were daring him to stop them. Part 6, closing in on the 5th. Hensley slammed the receiver down, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed that time was running out. The taunts, the map, the carefully orchestrated murders. This wasn't just someone committing crimes. It was a ritual. A dark, methodical game. Carter appeared at the door, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand, his expression tight. You look like you just saw a ghost. Not a ghost, Hensley muttered, gesturing to the map. A predator. They're baiting me, Carter. Calling me out. Carter leaned against the desk, his eyes scanning the photos spread across it. If they're targeting you, why play these games? Why not just come straight at you? Because it's not about me. Hensley jabbed a finger at the grid of victims. It's about this. Every single one of them had someone watching them, stalking them, and then, nothing. No real leads, no suspects. And the pattern starts all over again. They're not just picking victims, they're building something. Carter frowned. Building what? I don't know yet, Hensley admitted, running a hand through his hair. But they want me to be part of it. Before Carter could respond, the phone on Hensley's desk buzzed again. This time, it was the station dispatcher. We've got a report of movement near the old mill on the east side of town, the dispatcher said, her voice tense. Caller says they saw someone running into the woods, carrying what looked like a bag. A bag? Hensley repeated. Did they see a face? Negative. Just said the person was moving fast, like they didn't want to be seen. Hensley grabbed his coat. Tell them we're on our way. The old mill was a hulking shadow against the night sky, its broken windows glowing faintly in the moonlight. The surrounding woods were dense, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and decay. Hensley and Carter moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping the ground for signs of movement. There, Carter whispered, pointing to a fresh set of footprints in the mud. They led toward the mill, disappearing into the yawning blackness of its open doorway. Inside, the mill was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling beams. The air was heavy with the sound of dripping water and the faint scuttle of rodents. Hensley's flashlight caught something glinting on the floor, a trail of small, dark droplets leading deeper into the structure. Blood, he murmured. They followed the trail to a corner of the mill where an old storage room stood with its door ajar. The light inside flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Hensley pushed the door open, his weapon raised. The room was small and cluttered with debris, but his eyes immediately locked onto the center. A burlap sack sat atop a crude wooden altar, its surface stained with dark streaks. Surrounding it were more photos, new ones. They were pinned to the walls in a chaotic array, each one showing a different face. Some were familiar, Eric Mathers, the Henderson family, the Mitchell boy. But others were new. Hensley's stomach churned as he saw his own face again, this time marked with a red X. Carter grabbed one of the photos off the wall. This one's fresh, he said. It's a woman. I think I've seen her around town. Hensley's heart sank as he recognized her face. That's Rebecca Marsh. She works at the library. Carter frowned. You think she's the next target? She might already be, Hensley replied grimly. He stepped closer to the altar and reached for the sack. Its weight felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. With a deep breath, he opened it. Inside was a crude mannequin, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. A note was pinned to its chest, written in the now familiar hand. The librarian is the key. Midnight reveals all. Carter, call it in, Hensley said, his voice tight. We're heading to the library? Now. Part 7, The Librarian's Silence. The library loomed ahead, its brick exterior bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. At this late hour, the The building was locked, its interior dark save for the faint flicker of a single light in an upstairs window. "That shouldn't be on," Carter muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Hensley felt a chill creep down his spine as he approached the glass doors. The night was deathly quiet, the town's usual hum of crickets and distant traffic eerily absent. He rapped on the glass. "Rebecca Marsh? This is Detective Hensley. Are you in there?" His voice echoed in the stillness, unanswered. Carter peered through the glass. "No movement. We're wasting time. If she's the target, every second counts." Hensley nodded and motioned for Carter to follow. They circled to the side of the building where an old emergency exit stood. The door had been jimmied open, its lock hanging by a thread. Hensley's stomach tightened at the sight. Inside, the library was suffocatingly quiet. Their flashlights swept over rows of bookshelves, casting long, eerie shadows. Hensley led the way toward the stairs, his ears straining for any sound. At the top of the stairs, the door to the reading room was slightly ajar. The flickering light seeped through the crack, a pulsing, unnatural glow. Hensley pushed the door open, bracing for the worst. The room was in disarray. Chairs lay toppled, books scattered across the floor. At the center of the chaos, a projector flickered, its reel spinning endlessly. The grainy image it cast onto the far wall made Hensley's blood run cold. It was footage of Rebecca Marsh, tied to a chair in what appeared to be the library's basement. Her head hung limp, her hair obscuring her face. Around her, shadows flickered as though someone, or something, moved just out of frame. "Jesus!" Carter breathed. "We need to move!" Hensley didn't reply. His eyes were locked on the screen, on the message scrawled across the wall behind Rebecca in dark, dripping letters. "Time's up, Detective." They descended into the basement with urgency, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The stairwell was narrow, the walls pressing in as if the building itself sought to suffocate them. At the bottom, the faint hum of electricity buzzed in the background, mingling with a sound that made Hensley's skin crawl, faint, irregular tapping. The basement was a sprawling labyrinth of storage rooms and forgotten corners. They followed the sound, their flashlights catching glimpses of old furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly. The tapping grew louder, leading them to a heavy metal door marked "Archive Room." Hensley pushed the door open, his weapon raised. The room beyond was small and dimly lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling. Rebecca was there, slumped in a chair, just as she had been in the footage. Her wrists were bound, her head still bowed. "Rebecca?" Hensley called, his voice cautious. She didn't respond. Hensley approached slowly, Carter covering him from the doorway. As he reached her, the first thing he noticed was the smell, metallic and wrong. The second was the unnatural angle of her neck. He lifted her head gently. Her eyes stared back, glassy and unseeing, her lips twisted into a grotesque imitation of a smile. Around her neck was a crude wire garrote, its ends tied off to the back of the chair. Carter cursed under his breath, but Hensley's attention was drawn to the envelope pinned to Rebecca's chest. The same wax seal. The same trembling handwriting. With shaking hands, he tore it open. The note inside read, "You were too late, Detective. Midnight is yours now." As Hensley's mind reeled, the bulb above flickered and dimmed. From the shadows of the basement came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Part 8. The Watcher in the Shadows. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway, swallowed by the suffocating silence. Hensley's flashlight beam cut through the dark, trembling slightly as it illuminated nothing but the empty hallway beyond. The air felt heavier now, as if the room itself was alive and watching. Carter's voice was barely above a whisper. "We're not alone down here." Hensley's grip tightened on his weapon. He moved back toward Rebecca's lifeless body, his mind racing. Whoever had done this was still here, somewhere in the maze of the basement. A faint metallic sound, like the scrape of a blade against stone, echoed from the corridor. It was slow and deliberate, designed to set their nerves on edge. Carter swallowed hard, his flashlight swinging wildly. "Stay calm," Hensley said, though his own voice was strained. We don't give them what they want. Another sound followed, a low, almost inhuman chuckle. It came from the far end of the hallway, where the darkness seemed to pulse and ripple like a living thing. Carter raised his weapon. I'm not playing this game, he muttered. Come out where I can see you. The laugh stopped abruptly, replaced by the sharp clang of something metallic hitting the floor. Hensley's flashlight darted to the source, revealing a small, blood-stained pocket knife lying in the middle of the hall. What the hell? Carter muttered, his voice cracking. Hensley's eyes darted back to Rebecca. Her hands were still tied, her body limp, but something had changed. Her head, which had been slumped forward, was now tilted slightly to the side, as if listening. Carter! Hensley began, but the words caught in his throat. Rebecca's lips twitched. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then her mouth opened, just enough for a faint, raspy whisper to escape. Run! The single word sent a bolt of ice through Hensley's spine. He stumbled back, his flashlight jerking to Rebecca's face. Her eyes were still lifeless, her body still slack, but that whisper, it had come from her. Carter didn't wait. He bolted for the stairs, his boots slamming against the concrete floor. Hensley hesitated, his instincts screaming to follow, but something held him in place. He stared into Rebecca's unmoving face, as if searching for an answer in her frozen expression. The darkness behind him shifted. Hensley spun just in time to catch a fleeting glimpse, a figure, impossibly tall and clad in dark, tattered clothing, standing at the edge of his flashlight's beam. The figure's face was obscured by a mask, a pale and featureless oval that seemed to drink in the light. And then it was gone, slipping back into the shadows like smoke. Detective! A voice rasped, low and guttural, echoing from every corner of the basement. It's your turn. Hensley didn't remember running. The next thing he knew, he was at the top of the stairs, gasping for air as Carter slammed the basement door shut behind them. They bolted out of the library and into the cold night, the adrenaline pounding in their veins. What the hell was that? Carter demanded, his face pale and drawn. Hensley didn't answer. He stared back at the library, its dark windows staring at him like empty eyes. His mind replayed the whisper, the figure, the mask. It wasn't just a killer, it was something worse. Something that had been waiting for him all along. We need backup, Carter said, reaching for his radio. This is... Hensley grabbed his arm. No. What? Carter's eyes widened. We're not going back in there. No, we're not. Hensley's voice was firm, but his hands trembled. But if we call for backup, we're bringing more people into this. This isn't just about us. It's bigger. Carter hesitated, his finger hovering over the radio's transmit button. Finally, he lowered it, his expression dark. What do we do then? Hensley's gaze lingered on the library for a moment longer. We figure it out. Before midnight. Part 9, Clockwork Shadows. The drive back to the station was silent, the tension suffocating. The events in the library looped in Hensley's mind, the grotesque tableau, Rebecca's whisper, the masked figure. The killer wasn't just taunting them. They were playing out something methodical, ritualistic. And now the game had turned its full focus onto him. At the station, Carter slammed his fist onto the desk. We're out of time, Hensley! Midnight's coming, and we're chasing shadows! Hensley didn't respond immediately. He paced the room, his eyes darting between the scattered photos and notes spread across the evidence board. Each pin on the map seemed to pulse with urgency, each face on the wall a reminder of their failure to save the victims. Rebecca's message, Hensley muttered finally. She said to run? But from what? Carter scoffed. The thing in the basement, maybe? Did you see that, whatever the hell it was? It's not just about the killer, Hensley replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. It's about the connections. Look at the victims. They're all chosen, marked in some way. Why? Why you? Carter asked. Why now? Hensley paused. The question hit harder than he expected. He'd spent decades in law enforcement, chasing killers, solving puzzles, burying the ghosts of those he couldn't save. But now the roles were reversed. He wasn't the hunter anymore, he was the prey. He turned back to the evidence board. His own photo stared back at him, marked with a crimson X. The word connected echoed in his mind. He grabbed the map and traced his finger over the pins. They formed a path, an unbroken line that led to the heart of Blackwood. The abandoned church, he said suddenly. It's at the center of the map. Carter frowned. The one they closed down after the fire 10 years ago? What does that have to do with this? It's the only place that fits, Hensley said, already grabbing his coat. It's where they'll finish this. Where they want me. The church was a skeletal husk, its charred spire jutting into the sky like a blackened claw. The wooden doors hung loosely on their hinges, creaking in the cold wind. Hensley and Carter approached cautiously, their weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with ash and decay. Pews lay in splintered heaps, and the altar was little more than a pile of rubble. But at the center of the nave, beneath the remnants of a shattered stained glass window, was a makeshift shrine. Candles burned low, their wax pooling on the cracked tiles. More photographs surrounded the shrine, pinned to wooden stakes driven into the ground. Hensley's stomach twisted as he recognized his own face again, larger than before, dominating the display. Beneath it, scrawled in blood-red paint, were the words, "Welcome home, detective." "This is insane," Carter whispered, his voice tight. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Hensley moved closer, his flashlight revealing more details. Symbols were etched into the floor, interlocking patterns that seemed to writhe and shift under the flickering light. In the center of the symbols was another mannequin, identical to the one in the mill, its head tilted in that grotesque, unnatural smile. A noise from above made them both freeze. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, echoing from the upper levels of the church. Hensley's grip tightened on his weapon as he gestured for Carter to follow. They ascended the crumbling staircase, each step groaning beneath their weight. At the top, they found a small, charred room. It was empty save for a single chair facing a shattered window. On the chair sat another note, pinned with the same wax seal. Hensley opened it with trembling hands. The message inside was brief. "It ends at midnight. Don't be late." Behind them, the church bells began to toll, each chime reverberating through the hollow structure. Midnight was minutes away. Hensley turned to Carter, his jaw tight. "It's here. Whatever they've planned, it's happening now." Part 10. Midnight Strikes. The 12th bell tolled, and the sound echoed through the hollow church, seeming to vibrate in Hensley's chest. The air grew dense, a weight pressing down on him as if the very structure of the building held its breath. "Do you feel that?" Carter whispered, his voice strained. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the cold. Hensley nodded. It wasn't just fear, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The flickering candlelight below seemed brighter now, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. He glanced at his watch. Midnight. From somewhere deep within the church came a low, rhythmic pounding. A heartbeat of sound, primal and steady, growing louder with each second. It resonated through the floors and walls, pulling Hensley toward the nave like a moth to a flame. "We need to go," Carter said, gripping Hensley's arm. "This isn't right. We can regroup, call for backup." "No time," Hensley replied, shaking him off. "This is what they've been waiting for. What they've been planning." Carter hesitated, but the pounding grew louder, more insistent. Reluctantly, he followed Hensley down the stairs, their flashlights trembling as they descended into the nave. The shrine in the center of the church had changed. The mannequin on the altar was gone, replaced by a figure standing motionless in its place. The mask was unmistakable, featureless and pale, its blank surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure was draped in black, its clothes tattered and frayed, as if it had stepped out of the void itself. "Detective Hensley," the figure said, its voice distorted, layered with a guttural resonance that seemed to scrape against Hensley's mind. "You made it." Hensley raised his weapon. "Who are you?" What do you want? The figure tilted its head slightly, the gesture almost curious. I am the shadow in your blood. The knot in your timeline. You are not here by chance, detective. You were chosen. Chosen for what? Hensley demanded, his voice rising. To understand, the figure replied. To become. Before Hensley could respond, the candles surrounding the shrine flared brightly, their flames leaping impossibly high. The light illuminated the photographs pinned around the room, and Hensley saw it now, faces overlapping, blending, as if the victims weren't separate people but fragments of the same story. His story. The pounding sound reached a crescendo, and the floor beneath the shrine cracked open, revealing a dark, yawning void. The figure stepped back, its arms spreading wide as if in offering. Every step you've taken has led here, it said. To the moment where truth and fear converge. Step forward, detective. See what lies beneath. Hensley hesitated, his weapon trembling in his hand. The void called to him, an almost magnetic pull that tightened his chest and quickened his breath. Carter grabbed his arm, panic in his voice. Hensley, don't! This is some kind of trap. Don't let them pull you in. The figure turned its head toward Carter, and for the first time, it moved closer, its presence suffocating. You do not belong. It rasped, the words sending a wave of nausea through Carter. This is not your moment. Carter stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Hensley, we need to go. Now! But Hensley couldn't move. His gaze was locked on the void, its darkness rippling like water. And then he saw it, faces emerging from the shadows, their expressions frozen in silent agony. The Mitchell boy. Rebecca Marsh. Eric Mathers. They reached out to him, their mouths moving in desperate whispers. Help us! Hensley's grip on his weapon slackened, his mind torn between fear and an inexplicable pull to understand. The figure loomed beside him now, its voice soft but insistent. Step forward, detective. Claim your truth. Carter's voice broke through the haze. Hensley, no! Don't do it! Hensley turned, his eyes meeting Carter's. For the first time, they were filled with something Carter had never seen before: acceptance. This is my path, Hensley said quietly. And then, he stepped into the void. Part 11, Descent into the Abyss. The moment Hensley's foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted violently. The church, the candles, the broken pews, all of it dissolved into a swirling maelstrom of shadows and light. He felt as if he were falling, weightless yet crushingly heavy, the sensation pulling at every fiber of his being. And then, with a jarring thud, he stopped. Hensley was no longer in the church. The air was thick, humid, and cloying, carrying the scent of rot and damp earth. Around him stretched an endless expanse of gnarled, twisted trees, their barks slick with something dark and glistening. The ground was uneven, covered in a dense carpet of decaying leaves that squelched underfoot. The figure was there too, standing motionless a few feet ahead. Its mask gleamed faintly, an unnatural glow in the oppressive darkness. Where are we? Hensley demanded, his voice echoing unnaturally. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it gestured to the ground at Hensley's feet. He looked down and froze. A body lay there, sprawled among the leaves. The face was familiar, too familiar. It was him. Blood pooled around the lifeless form, seeping into the earth, and Hensley's stomach twisted at the sight. You see it now, the figure rasped. The fractures in your reality. The pieces that have led you here. Hensley shook his head, stepping back. This isn't real. This is some kind of trick. Reality bends to those who see. The figure replied, its voice hollow. Every choice you've made has fed this moment. Every step has carved the path. From the shadows, shapes began to emerge. They moved slowly, their forms flickering like images on an old film reel. Hensley recognized them immediately, the victims. Eric Mathers, Rebecca Marsh, the Mitchell boy. And more, faces he hadn't seen in the evidence, stretching back years, decades. All of them stared at him with hollow, pleading eyes. You couldn't save us, one of them whispered, the voice echoing in his mind. You were too late, another said, its tone laced with sorrow. Hensley stumbled back, his heart hammering. I couldn't have stopped this. I didn't know. The figure stepped closer, its mask inches from Hensley's face. Ignorance does not absolve you. Their lives were threads, and you are the weaver. Your failures bound them to this place. Hensley's breathing quickened. What do you want from me? To understand, the figure said, its voice softer now. To see the truth. Look! It gestured again, and the ground beneath Hensley rippled like water. The faces of the victims began to merge, their features blurring into a single form, a grotesque amalgamation of all those lost. The figure knelt before Hensley, its hand reaching out. This is your truth, detective. To bear the weight of those you failed. To carry their voices, their pain. To never look away. Hensley's legs buckled, and he sank to his knees. The faces surrounded him now, whispering in unison, their voices weaving together into a deafening crescendo. Help us! Save us! You must! Back in the church, Carter stood frozen at the edge of the void, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The shrine was dark now, the candles extinguished, the symbols on the floor fading. And Hensley was gone. Detective! Carter shouted, his voice echoing in the empty nave. But there was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the abandoned church. And then, from the shadows, came a whisper, a faint, broken echo of Hensley's voice. Don't follow. Carter's flashlight flickered, and the air seemed to grow colder. He stared at the darkened void, his gut screaming at him to leave. But as he backed away, his eyes caught something new, a single photograph pinned to the altar. It was of him, Carter, his face marked with a fresh crimson X. Part 12, The Endless Circle. Carter's breath hitched as he stared at the photograph. His own face, eyes wide with fear, stared back at him from the altar. The crimson X over his image was still wet, the ink seeping into the edges of the paper like blood into fabric. No, Carter whispered, backing away. No, this isn't happening. But the oppressive silence of the church didn't care. It swallowed his words and replaced them with a faint, rhythmic sound, a heartbeat. It pulsed through the walls, the floor, and the air itself, growing louder with each passing second. Carter turned toward the void, but it was gone. The floor was whole again, the cracked tiles unbroken, as if it had never been there. The voice came next. Hensley's voice, soft and strained, but unmistakable. Carter! He whipped around, shining his flashlight into the shadows. Hensley! Where are you? Carter! The voice repeated, closer now, but wrong, warped, stretched, carrying a weight of something dark and hollow. The beam of his flashlight fell on the altar again, and his stomach churned. Hensley was standing there. Or at least, something that looked like Hensley. His face was pale, his features sharp and gaunt. His eyes, once full of life and determination, were now black pits, empty and endless. His lips curled into a hollow smile as he stepped forward, his movements jerky, like a marionette on frayed strings. Carter! Hensley's voice rasped, the sound scratching against Carter's mind. You're next. Carter raised his weapon, his hands trembling. Stay back! Whatever you are, stay the hell away! Hensley, or the thing wearing his face, tilted its head, that grotesque smile widening. You can't stop this. It's already begun. The photographs pinned around the church fluttered as if caught in an invisible wind, their edges curling and darkening. The faces began to melt, the features twisting into unrecognizable shapes. Carter stumbled back, his gun shaking. What do you want? He shouted. The thing took another step forward, its voice dropping to a guttural whisper. To show you. To bring you in. The heartbeat in the air quickened, and the floor beneath Carter's feet began to crack. Shadows seeped from the fractures, coiling around his legs like living tendrils. He struggled against them, firing his weapon into the dark, but the bullets passed through harmlessly. Join us, Carter, the voice whispered, now echoing from all around him. You've been chosen. No! Carter screamed, clawing at the shadows, his flashlight clattering to the ground. The darkness surged upward, swallowing him whole, and the last thing he saw was Hensley's hollow, smiling face. The church was silent once more, its walls bathed in the cold light of dawn. The shrine, the photographs, the symbols, all of it was gone, leaving no trace of what had occurred. But in the center of the nave, where the void had opened, a single photograph lay on the ground. It was of Carter, marked with a crimson X. And beneath it, in jagged handwriting, was a single word. Next. Epilogue. Weeks later, Blackwood was buzzing with rumors. 2 officers gone missing, Detective Michael Hensley and Officer Carter, both vanished without a trace. The church was searched, but it was empty, devoid of any evidence or answers. Only the townspeople noticed the subtle changes. New photographs began to appear in strange places, on lampposts, in alleyways, tacked to bulletin boards. They were always of someone local, someone known, and always marked with an X. The cycle had begun again.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.